I am Tracy Albernaz. I live in the South Coast in the town of Swansea. I'm active in the Massachusetts State Democratic Party on a local level as the treasurer of my town's Democratic Committee. And
I'm active in the Massachusetts State Democratic Party on a local level
as a member of the state committee. And we will be starting in just a few minutes. We are delighted to have so many activists, progressives, and advocates for greater transparency and democracy here. Feel free to put your name and location in the chat, and we're going to get started in just a minute. Welcome. See Erica from Great Barrington, Nancy from East Hampton,
Cindy Johnson from Fairhaven, my buddy. Thanks for coming.
It's great to see so many of you here. Are you ready to go, Nikki?
Sure.
All right.
I'm just looking at Cole and the numbers of people left to come in. How are we doing?
We're bringing them in as soon as they come in. We're getting like one every 10 seconds or so, you know. Most of them are in by now.
Okay, go ahead.
So it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce your host for this UnConvention, Nikki Osborne of Mattapoisett. Nikki has managed successful electoral campaigns, worked with Brand New Congress, and is a project leader for Bluebonnet Data. We are delighted that she has brought her energy and expertise to MPAOC in this past year.
Thank you, Tracy. I, along with the planning committee, and hope you too, are looking forward to the next couple of hours that we're going to spend together. We have really thought carefully about every minute. So together, along with our creative energies, we can move that progressive agenda forward with concrete action steps. First, I want to start with an invocation. We pay respects to the Indigenous people of the past, present, and future, the owners of the land where we gather today in various places throughout the state. We honor the land itself, which remains sacred to the Massachusetts and other Indigenous tribes in the state. Okay, so we have to ask ourselves, why an UnConvention and why now? First, we need to recognize the purpose of a convention. It's to nominate the right candidates, which we seem to be able to do. But we're also supposed to set out a platform for them to run on, and that is the process that's failed. Our UnConvention is to bring new and needed progressive energy to a withered Democratic Party so that we can enact legislation for the people. We don't need a convention just to play inside baseball, especially with the kind of days that we've had. We need to do better. I found this quote, which I thought was kind of funny. I thought I should throw in a joke here. As Will Rogers said, I'm not a member of any organized political party. I'm a Democrat. So let's get organized. So I thought that was a kind of a cute little pep talk. So we have to think about, but why now? We all know that America is in political crisis, and we are in fact contributing to it. Massachusetts must regain its political leadership. We have no time to waste, and we know that. That time for action is now, and it's long overdue. How long should people have to wait for a living wage, for healthcare, for affordable housing, to be able to vote, to deal with climate change and other crucial issues that have often been identified as progressive, but not the central priorities of the Democratic Party? As Danielle Allan asks, how can we advance policy innovation for the issues most impacting people's lives? Let's keep that question in mind as we go through the day and the couple of hours and the breakout sessions. At this point, it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Robert Kuttner. Robert is the co-founder and co-editor of the American Prospect and also a professor at Brandeis University's Heller School. He's written a lot about the Massachusetts Democratic Party, and I urge you, if you haven't already, to read about in his article, Massachusetts Blues. Today, he's going to speak on turning progressive sentiments into progressive government. And if you folks would like to ask him any questions, please put them in the chat, and we'll try to get to them if time permits. So without further ado, I will turn this over to Robert.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks for the invitation. And thanks for organizing this UnConvention, which we certainly need. So some of you have read my piece in the American Prospect called Massachusetts Blues. As I wrote in that article, Massachusetts seems to be among the most progressive states in the nation. It has a Democratic trifecta. It sends an all-Democrat delegation to Washington, including Elizabeth Warren, Ed Markey, doesn't get much better than that. And in the past 2 years, Massachusetts voters have rejected the long era of clubby, male, centrist, white ethnic politics. We have Michelle Wu as mayor of Boston, the first woman, the first Asian American. We have Maura Healey, the former attorney general and out lesbian, as governor. To succeed Maura as AG, we have a crusading progressive Andrea Campbell, the first African American attorney general. And Democrats now hold every single statewide office. In addition to the governor, the mayor of Boston, and the AG, the state treasurer, the lieutenant governor, and the state auditor are all women. The U.S. House member for Boston and some inner suburbs since 2019, Ayanna Pressley, is the first Black representative from Massachusetts in the U.S. House and one of the most progressive members of Congress. Polls confirm that Bay State voters are resolutely progressive on a range of issues. So what could possibly go wrong? Well, in fact, Massachusetts continues to lag well behind other trifecta states on politics and policies actually achieved. And if you unpack why this is the case, you appreciate that it isn't only right-wing Republicans who undermine both democracy and popular faith in democracy and the ability of democracy to achieve good policies. It's also corporate Democrats in one-party states. So why do hack Democrats have so much of a stranglehold on the politics of the possible in California, in the Commonwealth, rather? And here I put on my my political scientist hat. And the point is that most of the obstacles are, in fact, structural. And first of all, as my article details, and there's another good article on this in the current Commonwealth Beacon, we have the most autocratic state legislature in the nation. There are no recorded votes in House committees where legislation is often sent to die, making it impossible to hold state reps accountable. The leadership and lobbyists simply make deals behind closed doors. Full texts of bills are often unavailable, and final passage on the floor is usually by voice vote. Technically, a member may demand a roll call, and it does happen once in a while, but to do so is to court retribution. Outing a fellow member to, quote, take a difficult vote, even has a uniquely Beacon Hill term of opprobrium. It's called spotting, and it's considered an unfriendly act. You could end up having your office moved to a broom closet or your desk put out in the hall. That actually happened to the young Eddie Markey, who crossed the leadership when he was a state rep. And Markey famously said, "They can tell me where to sit, but nobody tells me where to stand." The problem is too few elected officials in Massachusetts are willing to stand up to the leadership in that fashion. And to further re-entrench boss rule, the speaker can augment the $73,000 base pay of state reps by sums as much as $88,000. He can do this for more than half of the 160 members of the House by naming them as committee chairs or vice chairs or other honorary leadership positions. And just today in the Globe, the paper reported that 20% of House committees held no hearings whatsoever in the past 2 years, even though their committee chairs still collected their extra stipends of as much as $162,000 a year. So do you think any of these chairs will cross the leadership? And legislative boss rule creates feedback loops because even progressive groups who resent Speaker Ron Mariano and his cronies still have to work with him to get half a loaf. That's especially true of unions. SEIU, for example, is simultaneously the richest and generally the most progressive union in the Commonwealth, but a lot of its members are public employees whose earnings are dependent on what's in the state budget. So the union carefully picks its shots when it decides when and whether to cross the Beacon Hill leadership. A second compounding problem is the lack of home rule. Beginning in the 1920s, as Irish politicians came to nominate the city of Boston. The state legislature, which was still controlled by Brahmin Republicans, acted to strip Boston of home rule. Other than property tax, Boston has no power to tax, leaving it vulnerable to the legislature for local fiscal aid. There is no other state where municipalities have such a limited tax base. The property tax accounts for fully 58% of Boston's revenue. In other major cities, the property tax averages only about 20%. San Francisco levies a business license tax, a real property transfer tax, a utility user tax, a parking tax, and a transient occupancy tax. Chicago has more than a dozen local taxes. Seattle and Oakland have local taxes dedicated to mass transit. Boston, with the world's oldest subway system and the country's worst traffic congestion, can't do any of that. And so Massachusetts cities regularly file home rule petitions with the legislature, humbly asking for the authority to enact rent control or a real estate transfer tax to pay for affordable housing. And these are usually rejected by the standard method of burying them in committee. All of this serves to blunt progressive impulses on the part of a mayor and to weaken the effect of progressive public officials by making them seem ineffectual. All of this feeds on itself. It cements the alliance between business elites, their allies in the legislature, and state governors. Now, a third problem, a structural problem, is fragmentation on the progressive left, where we have an embarrassment of riches. We have too many groups, many of them small, which overlap each other in mission and membership and competition for funding, as well as lack of consensus on strategies. One capacity that is largely missing is the ability to take out incumbents in the legislature. And a related problem is money and the psychology of what it means to be a large donor. If you have serious money to spend on progressive politics, it's typically much more compelling to donate to a Warren or a Markey or a presidential candidate or a candidate for mayor or governor than to donate to an insurgent trying to take out a hack state legislature. Although 20 such victories or even 10 such victories could make a huge difference. So in addition, Warren or Markey have very effective fundraising apparatuses that insurgent candidates for the legislature can't begin to duplicate. That creates a kind of chicken and egg problem where good people don't run because they don't think they can raise the money to wage a serious campaign. And even when good people occasionally do get elected to the legislature, after spending X number of years not getting anything done as backbenchers, many of them just decide, hey, I need to get a life, and they go on to do something else. So the insurgency and the accountability in the legislature never reaches anything like critical mass, despite the fact that most residents of the Commonwealth, most voters, would rather see a much more progressive legislature. Now, in other blue states, blue trifecta states like Connecticut or California or Minnesota, where you have effective alliances among grassroots groups, trade unions, the legislature, and governor, you get progressive wins, even when you have very narrow democratic controls, as you do in Minnesota, because you have a degree of discipline and a common sense of ideology and strategy. But in Massachusetts, where the House has 133 Democrats and only 25 Republicans, the Republicans are not a factor, and most Democrats' seats are safe. Of the 160 state reps in the most recent election, 116 ran unopposed. So incumbents have little to fear from voters, and they pay more attention to donors and corporate lobbyists and local real estate interests. The presumptive opposition party is that minority of progressive Democrats on Beacon Hill, but most are either co-opted or intimidated, or they give up after a few terms to do something else with their lives. There is, for example, a House Progressive Caucus, which nominally has had as many as 60 members, but it has no staff, no website, takes no formal positions, and never crosses the leadership as a caucus. So all of this makes even Democratic governors inclined to be centrist because the power of business lobbies and developers is disproportionate and not counterbalanced by the power of progressive activists and organizations. Until Maura Healey, 5 of the past 6 governors in the Commonwealth have been centrist Republicans, liberalist on social issues, conservative on economic issues, and largely in the pocket of business. And that suits the legislature just fine. Healey won the election in a walk by a majority of more than 2 to 1. So she had a mandate for a progressive program if she chose to use it. But Healey was mindful of the experience of the last Democratic governor, Deval Patrick, a progressive who went public with a bold program that was cut to shreds by the legislature and the business lobbies. So Healey wanted to signal a business-friendly administration. And as her first high-profile act, Healey, with great fanfare, signed a tax cut bill, slashing the estate tax and the short-term capital gains tax, as well as changing the sales tax formula to make it easier for multi-state tax corporations to game the tax system. Her move infuriated progressives who have been fighting for decades for progressive income tax. That finally succeeded with 2 ballot initiatives enacted over 4 years, which took effect in 2023, adding a new top bracket of 9% for millionaires to the otherwise flat tax rate of 5%, and dedicating the proceeds to education and transportation. When these policies finally do get enacted, they are broadly popular. The problem is getting them enacted. Fair Share Amendment produced a revenue windfall of close to $2 billion a year, and Healey's tax cut gave much of that back to the wealthiest residents of Massachusetts. So if you take the case of Mayor Wu, who has strong allies on the city council and is generally popular, she could well face an opponent well funded by organized business because of many of the same structural forces. To the extent that she supports rent control or a tax on landlords to support affordable housing, or takes control of the BPDA so that it is not run by developers, she courts the opposition of developers and business groups that generally got along just beautifully from Mayors Menino and Walsh. And she's likely to face a very well-financed opponent, financed by organized business. And since Boston politics are still relatively tribal, and Wu, as an Asian American, comes from a relatively strong tribe, the cynic in me suspects that the business community could well find a corporate-friendly African American to run against her, kind of both from the left and from the right. So where might reform come from? Well, it's not going to come from the legislature. One brief reform episode did occur in 1984 when a particularly autocratic House Speaker named Tommy McGee crossed his heir apparent, Majority Leader George Keverian. McGee had promised to retire so that Keverian could become Speaker, but then at the last minute changed his mind. And so Keverian led a backbench revolt that deposed McGee. When he became Speaker in 1985, Keverian reformed the rules to make the legislative process more transparent. But as soon as Keverian left the post in 1991, his successor reinstated all the autocratic old rules and then some. So it will take a dramatic upsurge of progressive organizing, including primary challenges, to fundamentally change the game. Problem is, Massachusetts has no single statewide progressive coalition that agrees on issues and strategies, has individual members, endorses candidates, raises money, recruits activists, runs challengers, and recruits voter files. You have an intermittent pickup team called Raise Up Mass, which periodically goes into high gear to sponsor ballot initiatives, but these are a last resort. They're expensive. And we've only won 5 of these in recent years: to raise the minimum wage, a law mandating paid sick days, a paid family medical leave act, and most recently, the Fair Share millionaires tax. And in some cases, the Raise Up Mass Coalition ends up negotiating a deal with the legislature. But this is no substitute for a day in, day out progressive grassroots organization. And if you look at the history of the past several decades, this organizational deficit goes back to the collapse of mass fair share in the early 1980s. Fair Share, which was founded in 1975, at its peak had 110,000 dues-paying members in chapters in cities all over the state. Organizers organized local people, Saul Alinsky style. Issues were defined by the membership, and Fair Share could turn out hundreds and even thousands of people at meetings to press for policy changes on such signature issues as schools and public services, utility rates, rent control, and taxes. But ever since the collapse of Fair Share in the early 1980s, due to a combination of internal mismanagement and over-reliance on Vista volunteers, a program that was killed by Ronald Reagan, repeated efforts to recreate something like Fair Share have faltered. One of Fair Share leaders, Miles Rappaport, moved to Connecticut, where he and fellow organizers succeeded in creating a broad statewide grassroots coalition called the Connecticut Citizen Action Group, which in turn incubated activists to run for the legislature, where they and their allies did form an effective progressive caucus. Rappaport was one of the first insurgents to win elective to the Connecticut State House, beating an entrenched regular, and then became majority whip, and then ran statewide to become the Secretary of the State. And so today, Connecticut, which had been pretty much Republican, is now pretty solidly Democrat and progressive Democrat as well. And so I think two key differences account for the difference between the Connecticut experience and the Massachusetts experience. First of all, Connecticut never had the kind of boss-dominated rules in the legislature that Massachusetts has had for a very long time. And secondly, all committee votes are reported, roll calls are normal, floor amendments are not considered unfriendly acts, full texts of bills are available, details are negotiable, challenges to the leadership position are not viewed as hostile acts. So all of that makes it possible to hold legislators accountable. And then in addition, insurgents are well organized and regularly run challengers against pro-business Democrats. And also, Connecticut is one of two states, along with New York, that permits fusion voting. That means that a candidate can run on more than one ballot line, which in turn has created an opening for one of the most progressive quasi-parties in the country, the Working Families Party. And so a Working Families Party endorsement brings on-the-ground campaign help, and it also helps progressives unite around a coherent program, ideology, and set of strategies. So when Rappaport ran statewide and was elected Secretary of the State, in those years, the third party, this was before Working Families, the third party was called a Connecticut Party. And Rappaport received about 500,000 votes on the Democratic Party line and another 100,000 on the Connecticut Party line, and he won by 2,000 votes. So Working Families Party has had substantial influence in New York and Connecticut, which are the two states that allow fusion voting, but it's also moving into about 16 other states that don't allow fusion voting as a quasi-party, and has begun to make some inroads in Massachusetts. And the interesting case in point there is Worcester, where Working Families has created a kind of a brand and an identity, and it endorses candidates. And if you win the Working Families endorsement, that gives you volunteers who are good at door knocking, good at organizing, and Working Families now has 4 of the 9 council seats in Worcester and several seats on the school committee. So I think, to conclude, this organizing has to begin from the bottom up. It has to build a community of voters and candidates and donors and activist groups who come together to do what a political party does: to make endorsements, to recruit candidates, and to create a coherent strategy. So I really applaud what you're doing. This is not easy. It takes a commitment for the long haul. You're asking the right questions. And in our remaining time, I would be very happy to respond to a few of them. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Robert. That was very inspiring, and I think you really have set a good stage for our, not only our breakouts, but for further discussion. So at this point, we're going to have Tracy ask a couple of questions that people put in the chat.
So Arlene asked, have the mayors in Massachusetts ever gotten together to discuss the need for them to get home rule here?
That's a great question, and the answer is I don't know. And the problem is that under the existing laws, you got to go hat in hand to the legislature with a home rule petition. And I'm not enough of a constitutional lawyer to know whether that takes a change in the Constitution. I'm guessing it does. I'm almost certain that it does. And you would need a constitutional amendment to change the ground rules so that more home rule were just a matter of law. And then you would not have to go to the legislature every time you wanted to have local option rent control, or every time you wanted to pass a tax on property transfers, or all the other things. Jonathan Cohen says confirming it does require a constitutional amendment. But that's a very good project. So I applaud the question, and it would be transformative. And then, of course, and this is Alinsky 101, if you can win something like that, it demonstrates that you have power. And then you can go on to win other stuff.
Yep, good point.
Thank you. Let's see, I've got another question here from Patrick. What might be the impact of the failing prices for office buildings in Boston be? Like Boston City Hall and Beacon Hill. Significant lobbies might seek changes from government. Might this be an opportunity to seek progressive changes if changes in the air?
Yeah, and I think he meant falling prices. Well, from the point of view of a landlord, it's failing prices. So this is very double-edged. I mean, on the one hand, if you have a lot of vacant office buildings and you have the right policies for converting them into rental housing, it does create an opportunity to create some housing. On the other hand, it makes landlords even more agitated and more angry. And so when Mayor Wu has proposed raising some taxes to compensate for the fact that falling property values have led to shortfalls in the property tax, that makes landlords and property owners and developers even more determined to get her out of office. So it's kind of double-edged. It creates an organizing opportunity. It also makes landlords even more ferocious as a political force.
Yeah, let's see. We have time
All
for
right.
more. Yep,
One more, Nikki?
sure.
All right. Let's see. So Bill had said the progressive left has total power in Massachusetts, and yet it has left thousands of people to die on the streets. They have talked about this consistently to no avail. Nobody supported Janie Wu for Mass and Cash. How do you expect anyone to support you if you treat your own citizens like this?
Well, the progressive left doesn't have total power. That's the point. It looks like the progressive left has total power. But if you look at the structural obstacles to actually getting things done, and you look at the autocratic nature of the state legislature, the progressive left, even though we have public opinion on our side, our path to power has been blocked unless we get much better organized to transform the rules, to put incumbents on notice that we are going to take them out if they're not more accountable. So I think the question really illustrates in great detail the problem. It looks like we have power. We're being held accountable for power that we don't have. And as Rand Wilson says in the chat, corporate Democrats are in charge. And that's the reality that we have to change.
Do you have any thoughts about how we can change that?
Well, I think I've articulated the thoughts that I have. It
Uh-huh.
means getting organized.
Yep,
It means the small groups on the left that each have their own separate agendas really need to come together
Yep.
and hash out a common agenda, a common strategy, candidate endorsement, all the things that a real political party does.
right. Good. So any last minute questions for
Yeah,
Robert?
Nick, somebody's asking, I'm trying to find the question. It was about ranked choice voting here. Doesn't ranked choice voting also facilitate the ability of diverse and fragmented political groups to coordinate and win when their interests and concerns overlap?
Mostly it does. There have been cases like in the New York City mayoralty where ranked choice voting backfires if progressives can't agree on a candidate. I mean, we got a very reactionary mayor of New York because progressives fragmented. So ranked choice voting is very tricky. I don't think it's a panacea. I think if circumstances are favorable in other respects, it can be a good reform.
Well, it seems to me that whatever, strategy we employ, it takes time, but those seeds need to get planted now, and that it's already late and we need to water them. We need to get moving. And that's what we're trying to do here today. So thank you very much for speaking to us today. Bob, we really, really appreciate it.
No, thanks so much for the work that you're all doing. I really deeply appreciate it.
Well, we probably will call on you again to help us think through some ideas here that we have, okay?
Godspeed.
Okay, great. Thanks again. It's my pleasure at this point to introduce Danielle Allan. She is an internationally recognized expert on the structures of democracy. She is the founder and president of Partners in Democracy and a seasoned nonprofit leader. I have heard her speak a couple of times and I've always learned something new from her. So she's going to give us a little brief overview of her breakout session, where she'll be speaking on voice and choice, key reforms to make democracy real. And I don't know if you can tie any of this back to what Robert just said, but it sounds like there's a thread here that I'm sure you can pull on. And we look forward to hearing what your breakout session will be about.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Nikki. Robert, thank you for that fantastic keynote. And thank you to all the organizers of this important conversation. It is great to be here with all of you. I'm Danielle Allan. As Nikki said, I'm a combo of a Harvard prof and democracy advocate. And as many of you have heard me say, what I work on is just democracy, past, present, and future, with no question mark on the end of that, as far as I'm concerned. And I'm always enjoying sharing that is a focus I come by super honestly. It's a matter of my basic family inheritance. My granddad helped found one of the first NAACP chapters in Northern Florida in the 40s. Northern Florida is basically the same thing as Southern Georgia. So he was taking his life into his hands at the time. Lynchings were on the rise. And on my mom's side, my great-grandparents helped fight for women's right to vote. I love elevating my great-granddad, who marched with suffragettes on Boston Common in 1917. So he was an early ally. So both sides of my family, people have the view that empowerment is the bedrock for human thriving, for human flourishing, for human well-being. That really is what motivates me. And I will admit that as a young person, I pretty much took the value of democracy for granted. I grew up in this network, this huge family of incredibly civically engaged people. But as I watched my own generation come up in the world, I saw this real divergence in our life paths. So here I am, able to join you on a Saturday. I'm not working a second job. I'm a tenured faculty member at a great university. That is a position of huge privilege. I've got a brother who's a corporate executive. At the same time, kids I grew up with, my cousins, I used to run around in the streets playing football with them, are not with us any longer. And you've all heard me talk about this because of substance use disorder, because of gun violence, because of incarceration. And I realized that what my family was living through, this incredible pulling apart, is exactly what our country has lived through over the course of my lifetime. My 50 plus years on this planet track the rise of wealth inequality, the rise of income inequality, the rise of incarceration, and the rise of the polarization, which is the hyper problem that keeps us from getting anything done in this country. When we have common sense, straightforward solutions that we should be able to get through, we're not able to get them through. When we should be able to achieve basic sharing of power in this society, we're not able to get that through. So since 2009, when I lost my youngest cousin, I've been working really hard on democracy renovation. I started working on criminal justice reform, but again, it just became quickly clear that common sense reforms, you couldn't get them through, especially at the federal level because of governance dysfunction. So democracy renovation is the thing that drives my work. And that's what I will talk about today in the breakout group and work we can do here in Massachusetts. But I want to say something more about why this conversation today is so important and why your having an UnConvention is so very important. I'm here today, in fact, not as that Harvard prophet, not as that broad democracy advocate, but as a member of the Democratic Party in Massachusetts. It's not a small thing for me to say that I chair my ward committee, that I serve on the Democratic State Committee. It's not a small thing because I am a Democrat as a matter of choice. Many people will say that they've been a lifelong Democrat. That's not true in my case. I come from a family, you just heard, from Northern Florida. Northern Florida, when my dad and my aunts and uncles grew up, was run by the Southern Democrats. They were the Jim Crow Democrats. And half my aunts and uncles, and my dad included, left the South seeking a new life in Southern California. They maintained their civic engagement. They maintained their commitment to empowerment as that bedrock for human well-being. But they splintered in terms of how they were going to engage in politics. My aunt was on the ballot for Congress for the Peace and Freedom Party in the early 90s. And in the very same year, my dad was running for Senate from Southern California as a Reagan Republican. Now, we had ferocious dinner table conversations around core questions of how you actually deliver empowerment for families, for communities, how you change the dynamics of domination that we'd seen in the country. But what I realized watching them was that none of them had chosen the Democratic Party, all right? They had explicitly not chosen the Democratic Party because of the party that they had seen when they grew up in Northern Florida in the 40s, 50s, and early 60s. So when I made my own choice, my choice of the Democratic Party, I was choosing actually against my family. And I was choosing against my family because as I watched the party landscape in the 1990s and early 2000s, I believe that the Democratic Party best stood for that project of empowerment, that project of opportunity, that project of fairness, that project of inclusion. Now, what it means to say that I chose the Democratic Party is that it really matters to me that the Democratic Party deliver on those values. And there are many ways in which we've been very successful in Massachusetts. We have extraordinary constitutional officers. I am very proud to have put Maura Healey's name and nomination at the convention 2 years ago. And others as well in our constitutional officer set really do stand out. But at the same time, what's true for some of our new office holders is not true for our Commonwealth as a whole. We have voter registration rates for communities of color that are below the national average. We have the fewest contested elections in the country. We have the most restrictive candidate ballot access rules in the country. All of these things fit together. People don't have choices on their ballot, so they say, my vote doesn't matter. And they're not wrong. So they withdraw from participating. These things are tied together. And so as Robert was saying, we need accountability in order to drive important changes for people's lives through our state legislature. And the way you get accountability is through contested elections. So the question is, what can we do to secure democracy in Massachusetts and help strengthen democracy for our country as a whole? I'll conclude, because we're about to head to breakouts, by saying 3 things. First of all, right now, the most democracy supportive thing we can do is get Joe Biden elected. I want to say that out loud because I'm sure that in this room, there may be different points of view on that. But I really do think we do all need to come together and work for that election of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris in November. But that is not enough. It is also the case that our party, as a party, could function in more democratic ways, and we should be working toward that. I will talk about a party-based commission for healthy democracy that we could all support. In addition, beyond that, beyond what our party does, there are policies in our state that could deliver contested elections for us. I will talk about the Alaska election model in my breakout group, the top 4 or top 5 election system that Alaska has recently introduced that brings more voices into politics, gives people more choice, and makes room for a progressive agenda to be argued for, to be given real public airing all the way through to the November elections. So that's what we'll talk about in my breakout session, a party-based commission for healthy democracy and a top 5 election system for Massachusetts. I look forward to seeing you there. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. Boy, it sounds like a very interesting breakout session. So I look forward to hearing from you and the others about how that all worked out. So the next session here is going to our breakout sessions. There are 6 different